Welcome to the Dark Mind Podcast. Friends and familiars, thank you for tuning in to another episode of the Dark Mind Podcast, where we explore the boundless realm of dark literature and film. On today's show, I have a writer of both fiction and nonfiction who writes her prose with a strippery slant. A former adult entertainer, she brings her unique experience to the creation of stories that are both humorous and horrific. She's joining me today to talk about her recent work, South of Heaven, as well as her newest work, Colleen. So without further ado, join me as we delve into the dark insight of Erin Louis. Erin, welcome back to the show.
Nice to see you again.
Thank you for joining me on this 7th day of January 2024. When you were last on the show, it was to discuss your work of nonfiction, Expose Yourself. And shortly after that, you began a foray into fiction by collaborating with Armand Rosamilia on the novel Stripper Noir. So I was very interested when you released your first solo work of fiction, South of Heaven. And upon reading it, I found not only a darkly compelling story, but also a humorously compelling story, courtesy of Erin Louis's biting and acerbic wit. So I'm looking forward to delving into the gritty details.
Well, I'll give you as much as I can.
Well, so the book revolves around Kat, a young woman raised by a devout Catholic mother who disapproves of her leaving the church. And Kat works as a stripper, but keeps this a secret from her mom for obvious reasons. And living life on her own terms, Kat occasionally engages in activities that are technically illegal, but relatively harmless. But one day, she has a fatal accident and in her final moments decides to call out to Jesus to save her soul, in a way embracing Pascal's wager. To her surprise, she awakens in the afterlife, finding herself in line for judgment, and despite her checkered past, her last-minute plea earns her a place in heaven. The novel's central theme explores the bizarre notion that regardless of one's lifetime actions, a last-minute plea to Jesus can grant access to heaven. So could you share your thoughts and experiences regarding this unusual concept?
Well, I guess we had discussed last time when we were talking about Expose Yourself that my religious upbringing was actually pretty squishy when it came to Catholicism and stuff that I grew up with. It was very much like, just be a good person and you'll get to heaven. But as I kind of delved more into the secular community and I started to really kind of understand what a lot of other people were taught in terms of not just Catholicism, but religion in general, was that really the most important thing, as opposed to being a good person, was that you loved Jesus and that you sought forgiveness and salvation. And a lot of times that seemed to me as a cover to really do some horrible things. And then, basically use God, religion, the concept of salvation and forgiveness, God's mercy as kind of an excuse. Oh, well, I'm a sinner inherently. So I'm going to sin. As long as I say I'm sorry for it, it's cool. And I kind of found that as a secular humanist abhorrent. I think it really does give license to people to do some really awful things and then kind of shirk the responsibility or absolve themselves of it. I grew up in Orange County. My father was a small business owner. My parents were both raised very, very strict Catholic. I have 5 siblings that are all 9 to 14 years older than me. And so they had a more traditional Catholic upbringing than I did. By the time I came around, I think they had just pretty much, it had really like boiled down to, like I said before, be a good person, you go to heaven. I don't remember if we even had a Bible in the house. I know that we had a rosary. We went to church occasionally. The opening prologue, the scene is very much ripped from my thoughts as a kid, sitting in church being like, this is boring as hell. What am I doing here? I can't wait to leave. I could do something else. Like, I don't even get what this guy's saying. Then when you really do think about it, you're like, wow, that's twisted. So my Catholicism was much more, like when I say squishy, it really revolved around, the Orange County life in the mid to late 80s, which was mall and the Go-Go's and MTV and, capitalism and functional alcoholism. So Catholic Irish, I should say. So.
Nice. Yeah. Mine was unfortunately a little bit of the charismatic Protestant version. So, not even going to get into that. But one of the first things that Kat learns about heaven is that most of what she was told in church was true, but that without the contrast of pain and suffering, eternal bliss is a very sterile, almost empty feeling. So can you tell me a little bit about how you employed the dichotomy between pain and pleasure and comfort and suffering in the story? Because even as a child, that thought actually crossed my mind. They told me there's no more death, no more dying, no more pain. You will just spend eternity worshiping God. And I'm like, well, wouldn't that get boring at a certain point,
Well, that was a lot of my thought too. I mean, because obviously it's all speculative. I mean, nobody knows what heaven is like. So that was kind of my idea too, was that it's just bliss, it's paradise, it's all this great stuff. And going back to Orange County, because I lived so close to Disneyland, like I went to Disneyland a whole lot. And I remember making a comment when I was little about, I want to go to Disneyland every day. And of course, if you went to Disneyland every day, it wouldn't feel like Disneyland anymore. It would start to get boring and it would start to suck. And, really pulling that thread, thinking what heaven would be like if you could really just have anything you wanted. And then, of course, there's no suffering. So then what, are you not worried about other people? You're not worried about yourself. And if you think about heaven, a blissful place with exactly no suffering at all, well, now are we starting to delve into the more existential question of free will? What do you want? You always get what you want. There's nothing, relatively speaking, to compare it to.
Mm-hmm. And I guess I understand the argument of like, well, you're coming from the perception and context of your earthly understanding. Your mortal mind can't comprehend the way that it's going to work. You're using the viewpoint of your carnal mind, but it just seems like at some point God would at least make it something that you could somewhat wrap your head around, like just constantly setting the rules in opposition, constantly setting the comprehension as unknowable. It just seems like a bizarre thing to do. But one thing she discovers is that certain earthly carnal pleasures aren't available in heaven, sex being the most glaring example. And what's intriguing is that these particular pleasures are supposedly created by God. So in your story, why did God not allow them in a place that was supposed to provide eternal bliss, not only not allowing it, but making it completely impossible because of this Barbie doll-like lack of genitalia that you have once you get to heaven?
I think a lot of my thinking, at least at first, was the idea of sin and the idea of sex, and that very thing that he apparently graced us with is also like a horrible sin. Mm-hmm. And so I think part of my vision for my speculative heaven was, kind of a place without sin. You've been absolved of everything. You don't need it. So what would you really want that for? If now you're pure and you're saved and everything's great, what do you need that for? And also because of, what she went through, what her life was like on earth, it was absolutely a comedic device there because, I couldn't imagine how shitty would that be when you get to heaven. And like you said, if you bring who you are and our consciousness translates to the afterlife, right? If it didn't, then it's really pointless, right? Mm-hmm. If you go on after death, but you don't bring any elements of who you are with you, that also sort of adds to the like not paradise part of heaven. Like that sounds like that would suck, and Kat in particular, that was a big part of who she was. And so I really kind of wanted to highlight that idea that, if you go there, there's no suffering, everything's perfect, everything's great. Do you really actually maintain who you are as a person?
Yeah. And if you don't retain your consciousness, at least in some way, aren't you technically dead? Dead like you're not in the afterlife. You are literally dead, because even though this particular version of you exists, if it has no connection with the previous, it's almost like it's not the previous.
Yeah. I mean, my idea of heaven when I was a kid, because my parents were older and all my siblings were older, I lost my grandparents when I was a kid. I barely knew my grandparents. And I remember when I was very young and my grandmother died, one of the ways that you comfort people, and one of the ways that we do find comfort in death and grief, is to talk about meeting people, our loved ones in the afterlife. Particularly, actually, when I left religion and the idea of God and all that kind of stuff, that was a concept that was very difficult for me to let go of, because that's when the idea of death and like grief and loss really hits you, when you're like, this is forever, this is a whole thing. And I believe that heaven, the idea of an afterlife, all really provides some like soothing comfort to that idea, to that grief, being like, okay, well, there's a chance I'm going to see him again. But that kind of gets all negated if you can't be who you are in the afterlife, right? I mean, why do you give a shit if you see grandma again, if you don't remember the very few memories I have of my maternal grandmother? What would those matter if I didn't have those anymore? Like, would I still care to see her? And then who cares? What's the point?
Yeah. Yeah. I wish I could remember what I was told. Maybe you can, because I'm sure probably came up at some point. Did you ever ask anybody, could be family, could be friends, somebody you knew that the spouse died and then they remarried? Like what would happen once everybody's dead and they meet? Is it going to be awkward? What happens?
I mean, lucky for the Mormons, I guess. Maybe you're like better off that way. Yeah, no. And I think that's where the concept of this book really came from, is where, a lot of that stuff, like I said, I think a lot of the idea of an afterlife is really more of a salve and more of a device to make people feel better about loss and grief and their own death and all that kind of stuff. But when you really, really, really pull the thread of all these ideas and all these concepts, they become really problematic. Are you just, so what do? So you have a threesome in heaven? I mean, this is great. Now we're all just like together. Like, so now there's no jealousy. I mean, what if you don't really like the next wife or husband or spouse or whoever it is? I mean, like, how do you, and then once again, that comes back to the idea of, are you really who you are in the afterlife as you are on earth? Because maybe in the afterlife, you might get along with this person supposedly when on earth you wouldn't have. So what changes in your consciousness and your person, your soul, once you cross over to that realm?
Well, in heaven, there is also no reprieve from dumb, attractive men and catty, backstabbing women. And as a former stripper for over 20 years, was some of this drawn from your day-to-day life at the club? And if so, were any of the unsavory interactions between Kat and the men and women based on real incidents? And if so, could you tell us about some of them? And as an afterthought, I thought, well, maybe not at the club, maybe at the church you grew up in.
So most of those experiences were actually far more pulled from my childhood and like middle school.
Oh, okay.
And not really feeling like I fit in, not really feeling like I was ever going to be like the cool kid, always feeling judged for, like Kat, of course, is being judged for being slutty. As a kid, that was thankfully not my thing. That happened way later. But the one thing that I guess I was trying to illustrate, and especially because of my background in nonfiction, where my nonfiction is writing a lot about my life and, stuff like that. My fiction is really that. It's almost as revealing, if not more so, than any of the nonfiction that I've ever written. And so a lot of my thinking when it came to the angels and the kind of ostracization she felt and the kind of, not feeling good enough and all that kind of stuff, I would say most of that came from probably junior high and feeling that way, feeling like, they mock, like they want you to be included. They pretend like, oh, this is going to be great. Everything's great. And then they decide for whatever reason, you're not one of them. And so that was a lot of where that came from. From the time that like puberty hit, I definitely realized that I was a sexual being pretty early on. Like that was always a big part of my motivation, thought patterns. As soon as it started to come into my head, it was like pretty much ran my life. So when it came to the male aspect of that, that's a lot where that came from. And so I think because of those experiences, when I got into stripping, there was a lot of that cattiness, that clickiness, that kind of deal. I think I was more prepared for it. Mm-hmm. So I didn't have a lot of those types of instances feeling like ganged up on or bullied or things like that when I stripped, because I had already, frankly, built those walls and boundaries.
When did the idea of being a mean girl manifest, like to the point where people are actually trying to embody that archetype? Like, I mean, I know there's a movie called Mean Girls, right? Has that always been a thing? It's just like when you get to a certain age, it's cool to just be mean to people.
I don't know, man. I think it's a way of maybe lashing out and rejecting and hurting before you're hurt. So I think it may be more of a defense mechanism. That's, of course, coming from my own perspective of being bullied and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And feeling rejected. So my perspective is probably biased in that respect. But I do think that when you punch down, you feel better about yourself. And I think especially going through teenage years, middle school, and that kind of stuff, when you're trying to figure things out, things are growing weird and thoughts are happening and feelings are happening. And, maybe your nose hasn't quite caught up with the rest of your face, or like, you're constantly comparing yourself to other people. You're constantly feeling judged, wanting to be good enough, wanting to fit in, wanting to be attractive. So I think that kind of cultivates that sort of thing. So if you have somebody who's, maybe already feels like they're better than somebody else or wants to feel that way, I think it's easy to kind of click up, to tribe up and gang up on other people, because it just makes you feel better about yourself. How that relates to stripping is, well, that's a big motivation of me becoming a dancer in the first place. Number one, I have a real problem with authority. I'm not very good at being told what to do. And so that was like the independence part of it. But the other part of it was I never felt pretty. I never felt attractive. And stripping for me was a way to be empowered that way. But it was also coming from a place of deep insecurity. And I don't think that I'm alone. Actually, I know I'm not alone. And that being the motivation for doing that. A lot of girls felt that way where, you're up on stage. Now I'm not ugly. Now you're here to pay to see me, And so I think it becomes very empowering, but you still have those latent insecurities. And if those things haven't been dealt with, I certainly didn't deal with a lot of that stuff until I was, in my 30s. So, there were definitely times where I might have, given the side eye to girls I thought that were less than me and all that kind of stuff. So I think a lot of that type of mentality does carry over into the strip club. And I think that's part of what manifests that mean girl type mentality. The feeling to punch down to make yourself feel better.
Yeah. Well, one thing I noticed about your fiction, something that struck me about the story, was the description and depiction of Kat's death scene. There was implied gore, painful emotion, and it was actually a sexually charged atmosphere, aside from the fact that, it was a woman dying. And, or I guess I should say, regardless of the fact that it was a woman dying, she was still having sexual thoughts. And so I was wondering if you have ever considered writing fiction that delves into more transgressive and violent themes, which you may have done in works like Colleen or Stripper Noir. I haven't got a chance to read those yet.
Stripper Noir, definitely. It's about a stripper who's a serial killer. So there's quite a bit of violence there. And I had written some short stories before. I wrote one for a horror author named Brian Keene. I don't know if you're familiar with him. If you're not, read his stuff. He asked for like a guest short story on his Patreon page, and I did one of those, which was actually one of the most violent and disturbing. Like, it disturbed me. Like, it actually bothered me to write it. So I've definitely explored some of that in my shorter fiction. Absolutely. In Stripper Noir, Colleen has a lot of that, but there's a lot of humor. And I think that as I evolve from nonfiction to fiction, because I've disturbed myself with some of that stuff, the humor is like a protection for my own emotional, mental well-being, where I'm like, I have to make fun of this, because if I don't, I'm going to like really start like questioning like what the hell I got going on, like deep inside me. Why the hell am I thinking this shit? But yes, to answer your question, absolutely. I've absolutely delved into that kind of stuff. Like I said, Brian Keene, Armin Rosamelia does a lot of that stuff in his own writing. So we actually made a really good pair for that book. But yeah, there's a lot of that.
Well, during Kat's inner monologue, she reflected on the need to be cautious about indulging in donuts at the age of 26, aware that her metabolism might not allow her to maintain her physical attractiveness for much longer if she kept that up. And so it seemed like she was approaching an existential crisis as her 30th birthday drew closer. What was her state of mind before she died? Because you really don't get much of a view into it before the accident.
Her state of mind as far as where her life went, yeah, she was starting to question, okay, well, I'm mid-20s, going to take me forever to get through college, you know, that kind of thing, and starting to wonder how much longer can you actually do this, something I, you know, started questioning when I was 25 and still do now. But I think that was really separate because her death was so sudden. She wasn't really expecting it. I think it was kind of a shock to her. So I don't know that she had a lot of that stuff in her state of mind. I think she just really expected to just be nothing. It was like, okay, this is over. And then this is what's happening. So I think her state of mind didn't really come back to that kind of stuff. It was more just, this is ending.
Yeah. Well, kind of going back to the comedic aspects and how you were talking about how it's almost kind of a way that you produce some levity to deal with the dark stuff you're talking about. This particular book is filled with comedic moments, some to highlight hypocrisy, and then some it just seems like for the sake of comedy. So what was your favorite comedic moment from the book, and what inspired it?
My favorite comedic moment would have been when her heaven cat acquires his new body part. That was absolutely just for shits and giggles.
Now, I can't remember, was this, well, I don't want to divulge too much. For listeners at home, you're just going to have to read to find out what we're talking about. Well, have you ever done an open mic?
No.
At a comedy club? No?
It's funny because I was just talking to a friend about this. I was at like an event recently, but they had a stripper pole. They had a dance floor, but they had a stripper pole. And so, you know, nobody there really had known my background. So like I kind of got up on the pole and like did all that kind of stuff. And I'm very, very uncomfortable dancing like in a normal setting. But like, you know, give me a stage and pole and I'm in my element. And then we were joking about karaoke and whatever. And I had given a talk last year and I was so nervous to get up and talk in front of people, like so like crazy, like anxious, nervous. And it went fine. It was all over. Later that evening, they had like a karaoke session, sort of like to blow off steam from the heaviness of the day. And I showed my friend a picture of it where the talk, I'm so nervous. I feel like I'm going to barf. And then after I'm singing karaoke and I'm like super comfortable. I'm comfortable in that setting. So when it comes to like talking on stage and like actually like that terrifies me. That really does. Like I realize that it shouldn't. And I know that that sounds like counterintuitive, but it scares the shit out of me to think that I would get up and like try to make people laugh like en masse, like in person when everybody's looking at me. So
yeah.
I'd be more likely to just like take my top off and be like, here, are you entertained?
Are you not entertained?
I don't know what else to do. No, this is what I got. So.
Well, one of the things you describe about heaven in the book is that the only music allowed is Christian rock, which sounds more like hell to me. So I imagine you've been to a Christian rock concert. Can you?
Oh, never.
Never?
Oh, never.
Oh, my God.
No.
Oh, I used to go all the time.
Did you? Why?
Oh, yeah, because I was big on music and, you know, I would sneak CDs to listen to, like quote unquote secular rock music. But if I wanted to see something live, I didn't care if it was Christian. I just wanted to see a live rock band play. Even if it was cringe as hell, it was still cool to see technically proficient people play rock music.
I can definitely appreciate that. And
I even moshed at a Christian rock concert.
That's weird.
Yeah, rode the crowd. It was
I'm
amazing.
impressed.
Rode the crowd for Jesus. I walked on water.
Actually, I took my son to his first concert, which was Black Label Society. And then I did find out later on the lead singer and guitarist for that band does consider himself a warrior for Christ, which I found kind of weird, actually, because like his stage set, he had like a bunch of skulls and like a cross and, he's wearing a kilt. And he's like hot in like a dirty kind of way. So I don't know if they consider themselves a Christian band or not. I never got that from any of their lyrics or nothing. And it wouldn't stop me from going to another one of their concerts. As far as like music proficiency, he must be one of the greatest guitarists on the face of the planet. I've never seen anybody play guitar like that. It was really pretty amazing.
Is Jerry Cantrell in that band?
No.
Although,
like thinking about his voice and stuff, I can see why that might have crossed your mind, the deep tone that he has.
Yeah. Zakk Wylde used to play for Ozzy, right? Is that
correct? Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. It's been so long since I've listened to any kind of rock music. Well, speaking of rock and roll and getting wasted, in heaven you can have all the booze you want, but you can't get drunk really, because I guess your metabolism is too fast and there's no weed available for some reason. So the situation reminds me of Texas, where a lot of states have recreational weed and gambling legalized, but Texas hasn't. I can't even imagine how much money leaves Texas to go to our neighboring state of Louisiana to just get, dropped. So when I asked someone why a few years ago, they said it's because of the influence of Baptists. So I'm curious about your thoughts on why some Christians have issues with marijuana, but not booze, and if that weird interplay had anything to do with your story's portrayal.
In terms of the actual story and how that played in, that was more just a device for the story and probably a remnant of how I grew up, because like I mentioned earlier, my father's older, so he was very much influenced by stuff like reefer madness. So like weed was always like the gateway, like worst thing ever you could do. If you smoked weed, you would do heroin and become homeless and like all this other stuff. So I think that's part of where my thinking was that way, was really how I grew up, that like pot was like the worst thing in the whole world. Meanwhile, people would just get completely blotto and that was fine.
Yeah.
And like I said, I don't know if it's an Irish thing or a Catholic thing, or I'm just perpetuating stereotypes, but alcohol was something that was always really forgiven. It was always just like overlooked, like no big deal. And so I wanted her to have an outlet of some sort in heaven in some way, but I also wanted to highlight the hypocrisy of it and the fact that, it was really kind of a Band-Aid, maybe as it was for the adults in my life, as opposed to really like dealing with emotions and dealing with actual reality. It was a good way to just kind of pretend those aren't a thing. So she gets a pretty heavy buzz. But she never throws up. She just, so.
Well, so once Kat gets to her assigned home, and were these like the mansions that they talk about in church?
Man, I don't remember mansions being talked about in church, but I guess as I'm imagining my imaginary heaven, I was thinking, everybody's got to have a place like to go to live. And then when the social aspects of it, and I'm a pantser, by the way, apparently. I just learned this recently, that apparently you have plotters and you have pantsers. When it comes to nonfiction, I'm definitely a plotter, right? Because you already know the story. Everything's already all lined out. When it comes to fiction, it's sort of like, where is this taking me? I don't always know. Sometimes the characters just sort of do their own thing, and then that's just what happens. So as I'm thinking about heaven and the sociological like issues that she starts to have, she's got to have a place to go. And it seems like if people aren't going to get along in heaven and people are going to be dicks in heaven, then it would be better to have your own like space. And it would be more advantageous to God, who's really more the villain of the story, to keep people separate, right? Why would he want people getting together? He certainly wouldn't want people discussing what sucks about it.
Mhm.
So when I was thinking about her house and the houses in heaven, I wanted to make sure that everybody had a spot to go to be by themselves.
Yeah. Well, she had some very interesting neighbors on either side of her. One seems to be very nice at first until Kat finds out about the horrific crimes that she committed and that she, like Kat, still got a pass to come into heaven. The other one is literally Jeffrey Dahmer. So, being that Kat was a little sexually frustrated in heaven, did the thought of making the notorious serial killer neighbor a handsome guy like Ted Bundy cross your mind? And how did you end up deciding on Jeffrey Dahmer?
I would have to say that Jeffrey Dahmer himself was actually really the inspiration for the entire book itself.
Wow.
Because I had read somewhere that Christians actually hold him up as the pinnacle of mercy. He's like the poster child for salvation. If you can be this bad of a person and God can forgive you, and Jesus's blood and death and murder, crucifixion, whatever, can absolve you of all your sins so that you can be forgiven and love God and go to heaven, he's it, right? He became a Christian on death row and he died that way.
Oh, okay.
He died that way, and that was how they held him up. And so a lot of this book was born from the idea, like we talked about earlier, about sin and redemption and what is really the only requirement to get into heaven, which is loving God and accepting Jesus's salvation. That's really all you got to do. And it basically sets up for a malignant narcissist. It really kind of throws away the idea of being a good person on earth, being a good person to your fellow people, and just like not being a shithead. And so that's really, I guess, the overarching point of my whole book is really the absurdity of salvation, original sin, and the crucifixion of Christ. So.
Well, and like the literal technical thing that's happening when you ask to be saved is the fact that Jesus was a blood sacrifice for your sins. Like he was tortured and executed in the worst possible way. So not only were you born in original sin, the only way to get out of it was for a just horrific blood sacrifice, a horrific death.
And like I said before, it really, when you place it in the context of humanism and just being kind to your fellow human, at least in my worldview and the way that I try to live my life, I'm not always successful. What I strive for is, empathy and compassion for other human beings in the moment, not slapping somebody in the face and coming back and asking for forgiveness.
Yeah.
And saying, well, you must forgive me because Jesus died for all my sins. What the fuck? Why were you a dick in the first place? You know what I'm saying? Like it really removes the whole self-reflection, altering your behavior. It really just removes kindness and caring and empathy from the world when you think that, okay, we're all born rotten. And the only thing we have to do is basically ask for forgiveness. And particularly if we really want to get down to some of the worst elements of religion and how this idea of absolution and salvation really hurts people is the abuse that happens to children in a lot of churches, and not just Christianity, of course, pretty much any system that is set up in this manner where you're basically driven by a divine creator, which is mostly in your head and tells you what you want to hear. You're basically setting up to forgive yourself to do some really nasty things to other people. And that was really the overreaching point of South to Heaven. I mean, along with the butthole jokes.
Yeah. I was trying to generate a picture the other day of somebody running around heaven with a handful of halos.
Right? And there's got to be loopholes.
Uh-huh.
So,
Well, amidst all the dark comedy in the book, one poignant element stands out, which is Kat's want to contact her mother to let her know that she's okay and not burning in hell. The process to do this is exceptionally challenging, and if granted, she only has one shot to do it. And so your book explores an unconventional set of rules governing heaven and the afterlife. How did you create the unique world and its behaviors for the story, like the laws of nature in this particular context?
I guess I started with the idea that God created everything and can do whatever he wants. And being as the author, I mean, I'm God in that respect. So I can make it however I wanted. And, once again, we're getting into a speculative, imaginary realm based on the idea of loving and worshiping a deity that, intends to cause suffering, created suffering, like sort of set everything, all this up. So it didn't make sense to me for him to like make everything easy or to make, you know what I'm saying? Like, it's really just kind of, I guess, what the story needed to get my point across. And the point I was trying to make with her mother was that despite everything, she didn't like the idea of her mother suffering on earth. And she wanted to do what she could to alleviate that, if she could alleviate that, because she knew that her mother would be worried about it, which is another really twisted thing about Christianity, especially if you're going to take the online, keyboard warriors. You have Christians that will gloat. Oh, you're going to go to hell, or you're going to burn in hell. Oh, haha, you're going to hate it. All this kind of stuff. Well, what do you do when you have family members that you think are in hell? Like, how are you supposed to be in heaven and not have any suffering at all if you know that somebody you love is in heaven? And so that was kind of the idea I was trying to set up with Kat's mother was, she was supposed to be in this paradise. Everything was supposed to be, copacetic and cool. She's still concerned about her mother on earth, knowing that her mother would be concerned about her. So how in that respect can you create a perfect place with no suffering when you may be worried about the people you cared about and what happened to their souls?
Well, as described in the book, heaven doesn't seem like such a good deal because without the contrast of pain and suffering, it's a very sterile existence. And hell isn't amazing. It's just kind of like normal life, but it seems like you're surrounded by much cooler people. So what's the underlying message?
I think the underlying message is the facade that is heaven. I guess maybe going back to like the mean girl idea, right? Where you have this idealistic, this role, this life, this whole idea that everything's supposed to be perfect and everything's supposed to be great. And, that's never, ever the case. It just isn't in all of our understanding and in all of our concepts about heaven and hell and religion and gods and all that stuff. It all comes from human beings, all of it. So the whole idea of a perfect place and a perfect paradise and no suffering and all that kind of stuff is just so totally unrealistic and does not align with any of our human experiences at all. And I wanted hell to be an afterlife, but I wanted it to be more reflective of humanism and of just human life as we exist and the way that we think about relationships and interacting with other people.
Yeah, I was talking to a friend of mine who had not read the book, but I was kind of giving him the gist of it. And we were talking about the meaning of certain parts of it. And he said, well, maybe she's trying to say that if you think life sucks, maybe your point of view is skewed, like you're just looking at it the wrong way. Maybe right here, right now is a lot better than you realize.
Oh, yeah.
You've got this idealized version of what true happiness is, but if you put it into the pure context, it's like absolute misery.
I mean, I think it really would be. I wouldn't want anything to do with the heaven I created, that's for sure. No, I think that's absolutely true. Is going back to my nonfiction roots and even exposure self, I know that I address this quite often because for me, the idea of letting go of God and religion and that stuff was nothing. It wasn't really a big deal. It's like throwing away an old pair of shoes, right? It was like, okay, well, this is silly. This doesn't make sense to me. It certainly doesn't serve me. And it certainly seems to create a lot of harm and misery in the world. So that was easy to let go of. What was very difficult for me, particularly after losing my mom, who I was very, very close with, whose name was Catherine, by the way. If you notice, she hated being called Kathy. If you saw the dedication, I was like bawling when I was typing that to my publisher. But letting go of the idea of an afterlife, any kind of afterlife. Once I let go of religion, I looked for it in ghosts and the idea of a soul and, the idea of energy and all that kind of stuff. And letting go of that part of it was very, very difficult for me. But what I gained in that was having much more appreciation for my life as it is, as it has been, what it could be, and really valuing what I have now, the life, the consciousness, the relationships, letting go of the idea of any kind of an afterlife, that this is what we have right now, right here. This is it. It really gives a new appreciation to everything, every moment that is happy, every smile, every thing you see that's beautiful, that touches you, every, good thing that you do for other people, that matters right now. And I think ultimately, when we hang on to the idea of an afterlife, we're really letting go of the moment and the good things that we have right now, looking towards something that very likely doesn't exist.
Yeah. Well, great book all the way around. Listeners at home, be sure to check it out. So if you would, tell me a little bit about your newest work, Colleen.
Colleen is, actually, I have a friend named Colleen.
Okay.
And that book was very much inspired by a conversation we had about our names. And I won't get into how the whole sexy part of it came out up to it, but Colleen means wench in some definitions. And that ended up morphing into like sex demon. And like, my friend is very, very, very attractive, by the way. And so it very much kind of morphed into this whole like, well, that would be a great name for like a succubus. And then what would it be like to have a friend as one? And kind of how that would go. And succubus and incubus, they kill the people they sleep with. But my friend Colleen, and actually part of Colleen in the book, her personality was also influenced by another friend of mine. She just has this very like innocent curiosity about just the world and life and the way that she interacts with other people. And so I wanted my fictional Colleen to have that essence, to have that curiosity, that lust for life, and then the real lust. But also she's got to grapple with like who she is. And she goes delving onto the internet to figure that out and gets misled in all sorts of ways. So I absolutely work into like critical thinking and conspiracy theories, to add like levity to it, but also to kind of make the point that, be careful what you find on the internet, basically. And so, yeah, that's pretty much what Colleen is about. It's definitely dark humor. There are more like implied violence and implied sex. I guess I kind of like people to sort of run with those like concepts on their own. So I don't have a lot of descriptive in there, but there's lots of naughty parts. There's lots of scary-ish parts in there too. So there's a lot of murder. Well, accidental. She doesn't on accident. She didn't do it on purpose. She's a very sweet, sweet sex demon. She's very nice. She's well-intended.
Yeah. Very, very well-intended, sweet sex demon.
Most of the time, she's well-intended. So.
Well, tell me about your contribution to The Dead Shall Rise. And are these short stories or novellas?
That is a compilation of 3 zombie novellas. One is written by Armin Rosamilia. He actually asked me to contribute to the project. It's put out by Crystal Lake Publishing. South of Heaven, Serber Noir, and Colleen are all put out by Hellbound Books. But Crystal Lake has a series of anthologies of novellas, different like horror themes. So Armin asked me to contribute to the zombie one. And then also a friend of his, Jay Wilburn, who actually passed away shortly after finishing his story. So that ended up being, kind of bittersweet. Jay was actually one of the first or second podcasts I ever did. Jay was a Christian, by the way. And I just want to say this briefly because I am so active in the atheist community, is that Jay taught me a lot about understanding people's motivations behind believing in religion and spirituality. And Jay and I we had pretty much the same view on humans and people. We just came from different ends of the spectrum. Jay was a very good person and a prolific horror writer, awesome writer. So that's how I ended up contributing to The Dead Shall Rise. Of course, I set my zombie story in the strip club because, write what you know, and it's a really easy world for me to build zombies. And the whole story and everything that takes place was also very easily imagined. So.
Is that Lucifer?
It's Minerva. Actually, Minerva is, when I was Stripper Noir, I was trying to think of my main character's name, and turns out her name is Minerva, and that's her protesting that I made her into a serial killer. So.
Damn it.
I know.
Well, are you still writing for Only Sky Media, and do you have any other side writing gigs kind of in like the periodical or that kind of format?
All of my articles for Only Sky are still available. They have kind of moved in a different direction, not just from me, but have just sort of become affiliated with American Atheists. And so I have not contributed to them in quite a while. I do contribute to Free Inquiry, which is CFI, which is Center for Inquiry, one of their two publications. They have Skeptical Inquirer, which is excellent. If anybody is out there interested in skepticism, read about ghosts and aliens and psychics, it's great. And Free Inquiry is Secular Humanism magazine. So I write, a lot from that perspective. I write about doom scrolling, read about purity culture, actually in the secular community. It's not all religion. So I do still contribute there. My focus right now is mostly on fiction. Frankly, it's just more fun and I can still make my points.
A little bit of a side note. What is doom scrolling?
Well, in the context that I wrote about it, it started with like the political landscape that happened right before the 2016 election, where it was like, everything felt like an existential crisis. Everything felt like everything was going to fall apart. You're constantly looked to seeing like, oh my God, is this really happening? Like this can't be. And so it was just the constant refreshing of different social feeds, trying to get, some glimmer of information to the point where it becomes kind of all consuming.
Gotcha. Okay. I've heard the term thrown around a few times and like, what is doom scrolling? Well, I kind of have my own theory to this question, but I was wondering, are there specific authors or comedians who have influenced your approach to humor in writing? And if there is, I'm going to throw out one guess. George Carlin?
Oh, yeah. Oh,
Okay.
Of course. Of course. Definitely George Carlin when it came to like comedians. When it comes to writing, I mean, there's Neil Gaiman, there's Salman Rushdie, there's Stephen King, there's Brian Keene, there's Lois Duncan when I was a kid, V.C. Andrews, Christopher Moore, actually my son discovered, has a lot of those kind of dark elements, along with Clive Barker. Nonfiction when it came to like blunt and just kind of speaking my mind, there's Penn Jillette, who's terribly offensive sometimes. but that's kind of what I love about him, is that he's like, the whole no bullshit thing, like really, that's really like his shtick. There's just so many influences when it comes to writing and the comedy part of it.
I miss bullshit. Is that show still going on?
I'm not sure.
Because I don't have HBO. I don't have cable at all.
Yeah, I haven't looked at it in a minute.
Well, we've spoken about the book a few times. Before transitioning to writing standalone fiction books, you collaborated with Armand Rosamilia on Stripper Noir. So was that collaboration the impetus for your move from nonfiction to fiction? Did it kind of set a fire under you, or?
So Armand Rosamilia was really the first author, the first person that actually found my very first self-published book, Memoirs of a Stripper, which I had published basically out of spite. I was annoyed with the narrative about strippers in the media and books and all that stuff. And so I basically just kind of wrote this thing pissed off, being like, hey, look, at least here's one story that rings true to me, And he found it and contacted me. He was the first podcast I ever did and has really been kind of, to quote Bette Midler, the wind beneath my wings when it comes to keeping me writing. He was like, keep writing, keep writing, keep writing. And I was like, okay, but I'm terrible. And so he's kind of been holding my hand here and there throughout this whole process for me. So he had encouraged me to write short stories when he found out how much I liked fiction. And so, he really kind of pushed me to do some short stories. And then after I was kind of looking for a new project, and I was like, I really would like to expand on this whole fiction thing. 'Cause my love of writing started with fiction. It all started with horror fiction, the bullying and stuff that I experienced when I was a kid. That all drove me into the library. And then it drove me to the macabre and kind of the dark places, because I felt comfort and supported there. And so that's always been my baseline when it comes to reading. I don't want to say literature because, I wrote about cat butts. So, I'm not like Hemingway over here. So it was sort of like training wheels, I guess, for being able to write my first full length solo fiction. But I owe a lot to Armin in that respect. Probably would not be talking right now if it wasn't for him and his encouragement and his support.
Shout out to Armand Rosamilia.
definitely.
Or I guess I should say Armin. Am I pronouncing his name wrong?
I think so. It's really hard so here's the thing, when you read, it gets hard to know how you're pronouncing stuff right, but I'm pretty sure that's right. So he's on the East Coast. So anytime I mispronounce anything, I just sort of blame it on being in California.
Well, what are the key differences you've encountered in your writing process when crafting fiction compared to nonfiction? I mean, obviously one's factual and the other may be based on factual things, but is there anything as far as the approach to, like you said, you're a pantser, is that something new? Did you pants the nonfiction because you knew it so well?
When it came to the nonfiction, that was far more structured because I knew what I wanted to write from start to finish. And it was more about organizing it and putting it all into the way that it would read. So it's chronological order or just, my ideas and whatever just sort of came in that respect. But when it comes to fiction, it was more like, okay, I have this general idea and I'm going to start it from a scene and I'm going to kind of see where it goes. And so a lot of times my plots, my ideas, the twists and turns and stuff in the stories will sort of go with what fits in the moment and in the story. Like with Colleen, first I just wanted her to be a ghost. I didn't really want her to be this demon thing. And then the whole sexual element came into it. And I was like, oh, she's got to be this. This is what she is. This is who she is. And then it was as I'm writing, I'm kind of exploring not only who she is, but I'm exploring who her friend is. And, they're kind of on this journey together. It's almost like I'm on the ride and I don't really know necessarily what I'm expecting until I get there. With nonfiction, yeah, it's just a whole different animal. I start with a point that I want to make, and then I start to frame a way to explain what I'm trying to say within that context. But when it comes to fiction, I almost want to say that I don't have a lot of control necessarily of where the story goes. It sort of happens when it happens. So right now I'm very close to finishing the sequel to South of Heaven. You'll be shocked to learn it's going to be called Hell Awaits. So
nice.
Shout out to Slayer. And I'm not necessarily sure exactly how everything's going to work out yet. And I have 2/3 of it written. So I'm going to be just as curious as everybody else to see how it goes.
Yeah. Yeah, I've been told if you don't know how the book's going to end, the reader definitely won't either. Do you have any plans as far as whether it'll be something like a trilogy?
I have thought that, actually.
What's another Slayer song?
Oh, it would have to be Rain and Blood.
Okay,
right?
So South of Heaven, Hell Awaits, and Rain and Blood.
Yeah, because Satan is a thing, and he's the one that's in hell, and, without giving too much away, yeah. But I don't know. I'm really speculating at this point. Actually, when we finish, that's what I'm going to get to. I've kind of left her hanging there, so she's probably wondering what's going to happen to her, too. So...
Well, let's see here. I saw a picture of you in a McDonald's uniform with Ronald McDonald and was wondering how old you were. Was that your first job? And did you get into as much trouble as I did while working there?
I was 17 in that picture, shortly after I graduated high school. It was not technically my first job. I worked actually in an old Gold Rush town in a little sandwich ice cream shop. It was really my first job. I wouldn't say I got into trouble there. As much as I hate conformity and authority, I do tend to follow the rules when put in that situation, even if I'm bitching, complaining about it the whole time.
Mm-hmm.
I was actually pretty well behaved. Now I'm actually wondering the statute of limitations. So I probably did a few things that might have been untoward. But
yeah, you don't have to tell me what. I was just curious.
I was a minor and it was a long time ago. So let's just leave it at that.
Yeah, McDonald's was my first job. It was when I was 15 years old. My parents signed a work order. And they didn't really think it through too well because I was getting in trouble. I'm not going to say for what. So they were like, well, you need a job. You need some structure in your life. So they made me get a job at McDonald's, which was inside of a 24-hour Walmart. So I got into a lot of trouble with the people that work there. I didn't get in trouble like not doing my job. I showed up for work and did my job perfectly. It was just everybody else that worked there. It was like, okay, now I have about 19 new people to get in trouble with. So, well, I understand that you did some events at clubs where you actually stripped on stage and signed books afterwards. What were those events like? How did they go? And did any of the girls who worked there want to read your books, specifically the nonfiction?
So technically, I retired from stripping in 2019 when Expose Yourself came out. And that was also like my third or fourth or fifth, maybe retirement officially. But that was really like the big one. And of course, then, that whole like thing happened within the next couple of years after that. And in that time, I did a lot of writing and republished my first book, did a lot of stuff. And the owner of the last club that I worked for, basically what I refer to as my main club, even though I've danced at a lot of different places, he was willing to give me a feature spot. And usually features, not usually, like 99.9% of the time, features are porn stars. So they basically come and they do a few days leading up to the weekend. They do feature stages. They do book sign, or no, not book signings. They do, DVD signings and pictures and things like that. Mm-hmm. And so he offered me a mini feature spot where I would come and do a weekend kind of in between the other porn stars. And so basically I was treated like a feature where, my stages are sort of like the main event. And then I had books there to sign and I did lap dances and things like that. So I did 2 of those in 2022 and 2 of them last year. I'm currently waiting to see if I'm going to do any again this year. So, what were they like? For me, it was like going back to work. And as far as the girls go, they definitely fall into 2 facets, people that I worked with for a long time. Definitely in the Sacramento area. I'm probably what is considered an OG because I started working in 97. I just turned 45, which is hideous. But I guess it's better than being dead. So we'll just take that and run with it. But
40 is the new 20.
Yeah. So like I don't think anybody considers me like a role model. I know that some girls were interested in reading what I wrote as far as basically the same motivation as to why I started writing, which is where, there's so few writers and authors or journalists or people or anybody that actually speaks to the industry from an insider's point of view. And so I think from that respect, I had a lot of girls that were interested. Naturally, going back to the mean girl things, I got a few haters, which is always kind of fun. Sort of, especially because as a feature, I have a separate dressing room. So I'm not like in the same like area as everybody else. So that almost like makes that worse because
yeah,
because they're like, oh, this bitch. But yeah, some of them read it and I read some of my stuff. Some of them were definitely interested in the fiction part of it. The stripper serial killer, of course, appealed to some of them. Mostly she kills other strippers. So like, yeah, it was definitely appealing to that crowd. Some people that can relate. But yeah, it was actually really nice and kind of validating to work in that kind of profession and to come back and have people recognize at least that you're giving a voice to people that, while they may have a voice everywhere, it's not always accurate and it's not always reflective of at least our reality.
All right. Well, Erin, as always, it has been a pleasure talking with you.
Yeah, it was fun. Thank you.
So as we bring the show to a close, is there anything you'd like to plug or let your readers know about?
Really just my latest book, Colleen, with Hellbound Books. The Dead Shall Rise is going around. That's 3 really fun stories if you're into zombies. South of Heaven is definitely, if you're not into my nonfiction, on the secular side and the atheism side, is a way to sort of, dip your toes into that realm without, having to get too serious there. And of course, I definitely have the sequel in the works, which has just been a blast to write. It's been a lot of fun. So I'm hoping that when that comes out, thinking later this year at some point, people enjoy it as much as I did, as much as I enjoy writing it. So I think that's all the plugging I got.
All righty, sounds good. Well, listeners at home, all links are in the description. And Erin, thank you again for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
And thank you to everyone that tuned in. If you enjoyed today's episode, Please be sure to like, share, and subscribe. Be sure to tune in next Tuesday when I will be joined by a writer of novels and short stories that will bring you into a nightmare within the surreal confines of a gated community. So until then, stay healthy, stay sane, and as always, thank you for listening. See you next time.
I